John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back to John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast. Today we are doing something a little different. Instead of going to issue 146, I'm going to be reading an issue called Shoot that was originally supposed to be part of the Warren Ellis run, but it was quickly canceled due to the Columbine shooting because this issue deals with school shootings. And then it was never printed, and I think it wasn't even drawn maybe because the art is by Phil Jimenez, who is not the normal artist for the Warren Ellis run. So I'm thinking the script was written, it was approved, it was getting done art-wise, and then Columbine happened and they had to cancel it. But that's just an assumption on my part. It could have been done by Phil Jimenez and about to come out, and they just scrapped it as well. But either way, I believe now it is included in the Warren Ellis trades if you can get the collections that are his. I think there's only one collection. I think it's called Haunted. But for a long time, there was no way to read this issue or get it. Until they printed it in 2010 in a series called Vertigo, Resurrected. And I guess this was just like a way to print this and get it out there since people knew it existed. And it had been enough time since Columbine that they figured it was okay. So since this was supposed to be issue 141, I figured I could do this as like a special in between the Warren Ellis and Brian Azzarello runs. And just a little trigger warning, I normally don't do these, but this does involve, school shootings and kids being shot at school and playgrounds and stuff, so it's pretty intense. So I just wanted to warn people before, since this isn't like a numbered issue. So without further ado, let's read Hellblazer Shoot, which is part of the Vertigo Resurrected 100-page spectacular issue. We got a pretty simple cover, but it says everything it needs to. The cover is divided up into 3 horizontal panels. We see on the top panel, there is a young white boy, and in the middle panel, we have a .44 Magnum revolver handgun. And in the last panel, we have John Constantine looking out at us, and he is about to light a cigarette. And also on the cover, we see this is written by Warren Ellis, with art by Phil Jimenez and Andy Lanning. And we start off on the first page with what looks like some video footage. We get 6 TV screens, and in each one, we're seeing the first day of a boy arriving to school. And it's from the point of view of his mother in the car, like she's dropping him off. So we see a kid getting out of the car, and a woman says, "Bye now, David. You have a good day now, honey." And David turns his head slightly and calls back, "Mom!" And then he's walking further away through the entrance of the school, which is the playground, and she yells out, "Happy birthday! We'll be waiting for you this afternoon." Then she sees a boy approach David, and then that boy pulls out a gun, and she says, "David?" And then that boy shoots David in the face and kills him. And as David falls to the ground dead, the shooter puts a gun to his head, I guess to make us assume that he's going to shoot himself as well. But before we see that, we cut to an office where this is coming out of a TV, and there's a woman in an office, and she's watching this. And from the TV, we hear the mother screaming, "David," again. Then the woman pauses the video, and she pulls out a tape recorder. And she says, "Spokane incident notes. Much the same profile as the other investigated incidents. No motivation, no provocation, no explanation. Just dead kids." And then she sighs, and then she hits play again. And I should say that this is like obviously a work office, not a house office. And she is in like a dress skirt and a purple top that has like shoulder pads. So she's working in some sort of official capacity. So as she hits play, she sees her phone blinking, and she picks it up and says, "Penny Carnes? Oh, hi, Rick. Yes, I'm still on that government gig." "Well, what do you want them to call it? The Senate Committee on Why Children Blow Shit Out of Each Other in Playgrounds?" "Appreciate the thought, Rick, but that'll just have to wait. And so will your psychology department." Yeah. Yada, yada, yada. Get off the goddamn line. Bye." Then she removes the tape that was in the tape recorder and puts a new tape in and hits record and speaks into it saying, "Continuing notes. Paper on premeditated mass spree killings. The psychology of killers and victims. I keep coming back to Jonestown." And if you don't know what Jonestown is, you should definitely look it up. But this was a true event that happened in the late 70s, where a man who was kind of like a cult leader named Jim Jones got a bunch of his followers to move down to somewhere in South America. And they literally started a town and called it Jonestown. And then eventually he poisoned a bunch of Kool-Aid and his followers drank it. Some of them did, on their own, and some of them he forced them to. And this was like a big massacre. I think something like almost 1,000 people died there, including women, men, and children. And even the U.S. government was involved because there was a congressman who came down, I guess, to try to help the people and get them out of there. And he was shot and killed in that process. And this was such a big deal. It kind of came into the cultural zeitgeist. People now say things like, I think he's drinking the Kool-Aid, meaning that someone has played into someone else's scheme or someone's like a true believer. And that's where that saying came from. So Penny Carnes seems to think that the Jonestown massacre, I guess the psychology of it at least, has something to do with the school shooting incidents. So as she's digging through a box full of tapes, she's continuing to talk into her recorder saying, I've gotten permission to use my discoveries for the committee profiling schoolyard children's slayings in the paper, but I keep coming back to the Jonestown massacre. It's since I was given the tape. And then we see her pull out a specific tape and put it into a boombox player. And she continues speaking. Everything went to hell for Reverend Jim Jones in Jonestown, Guyana. He extorted his flock to commit suicide to save themselves from the shit Jones had brought down on them. Everyone drank poisoned Kool-Aid while Jones addressed them. 914 men, women, and children. Babies. And someone taped it. I listen to it every night. Have done for weeks. Then she hits play on the boombox and sits back and closes her eyes, and the last sermon of Jim Jones begins to play. And this is actually something that you can find. There are actual recordings of it and even like video and stuff too. So as Penny leans back and listens, we hear from the recording Jim Jones say, Simple, it's simple. There's no convulsions with it. Don't be afraid to die. Everybody keep your calm and try to keep your children calm. They're not crying from pain. It's just a little bitter tasting. And then there's a loud scream from a congregation member, which startles her. But then we cut to the next morning where she is asleep on the desk. So she, I guess, fell asleep while listening to that, which is horrible. And also she's sleeping face down, planted on top of the pictures of the dead kids of the case she's reviewing. Then we see a man walk into her office with coffee, and he says, "Oh, Penny," because he realizes that she didn't go home last night. So he puts a hand on her shoulder and he kind of shakes her and he says, "Come on now, Penny. Time to wake up, honey." And as she wakes up, she looks over her shoulder back at him and says, What? Okay. Then she sits up and asks, "What's time?" And he sits on her desk and he says, 9:15. How long you figure you slept? But she doesn't answer, and he says, "Drink your coffee. Got it squirted out of the devil's asshole, especially for you. I swear they get cows to shit in that coffee at night." And as she brings the cup of coffee up to her mouth, she smells it and goes, "Ugh." And then the man walks over to her window in the office, and as he looks out, he says, "But since you're here every night, and you've never mentioned anyone trying to sneak livestock past your door." But she cuts him off mid-sentence saying, "Brian," and he snaps back, "Don't Brian me. It's a Senate committee. It's like jury duty. Don't work yourself to death on it. Not worth it." And we can see her in the background arranging her hair, trying to straighten it up. And she says, "I got too much to do here to blow it off every night. God, I've got a whole bunch of killings on home videotape I gotta watch." And then Brian asks, "When's the last time you got more than 3 hours of sleep?" And she answers, "I don't sleep real well these days. It's not a problem." Then she takes a bite out of a donut, takes a sip of that gross coffee, grimaces at the taste of the coffee. Then we see now she is alone in her office and it is nighttime again. So I guess she was there all day. And she's watching more of these videos of children shooting other children. But this time she notices something in this video. In the background of the crowd around the kids that were just shot, most of the people are freaking out or screaming, except one man. There's one man in the crowd that is wearing a trench coat and has blonde hair and is a white guy in a suit. So it seems John is on this video, and he's not freaking out like everyone else. And when Penny sees him, she says, "Odd. I know I've seen him before. Jacksonville? Helen Volcano? Here. Can't be. And then she pulls out some more tapes from her desk drawer, and she puts another one in, and she fast forwards, and she says, tapes were made on opposite sides of the country, both in the last week. No way is the same guy going to be in both of them. Probably saw him on the street someplace. Maybe I should let Brian give me a lift home today. But then as she gets to the end of the video, she pauses on the audience and notices John is there. And she stares in disbelief and says, oh shit. And she covers her mouth as she says this. And as she stares at the screen, we hear Brian say from the door, you need that ride home, Penny? And Penny replies, no, thanks. Then Penny leaves her office and goes to sit on a park bench across the street. And I guess it's just to get some air. And as she sits there under the street light, she's talking to herself and she's saying, what does it mean? Same guy at 4 different child slaying incidents all over the country in the last 12 days. It's not a crime. It's not a cause. It's just creepy. But he's the only connective factor in 4 incidents. Then we turn the page and we cut back to her office where she's sitting with her knees pressed into her chest on her chair and she's listening to the Jim Jones sermon again. And from the tape she hears, please, for God's sake, let's get on with it. Then we hear a child yell, Mommy, Mommy, Mommy. And then Jim Jones says, we must die with dignity. We must hurry. Stop these hysterics. Then someone else screams, and he continues saying, death is 1,000,000 times more preferable to spending more days in this life. Then we get another scream, and then we hear another child yell out for her mother. And as she's listening to this horrific audio, Penny has printed out pictures or still frames from the videos of the moments just before the kids were shot, and then photos of after the children are shot and dead on the ground. And one of them in particular shows a girl who has a gun in her face, and she's just staring back at it. Her eyes look like they may be pleading, but they're also just kind of staring back at the gun. And we hear Jim Jones say, if you knew what was ahead, you'd be glad to be stepping over tonight. Then Penny stops the tape, and I think she's been listening to it all night, and she's very tired because she doesn't even hear Brian walk into her office, and he heard the very end of that tape recording, and he asks, what the fuck is this? That Marilyn Manson or something? And she turns around tiredly and says, huh? It's a recording of Jim Jones's last speech at Jonestown. Shut up. And then she stands up and grabs a bunch of the paperwork and files on her desk, and she says, turned something weird up yesterday. A repeater. And Brian asks, what? And then she pulls out a picture from the files of John, and she says, this man keeps turning up at schoolyard slayings. You've got lines into the FBI here. Police. All that. Find out who he is. Find out where he is. Then we turn the page and we cut to them waiting in front of a fax machine, and they're just kind of standing there, and Brian says, he said 5 minutes. He's had 5 minutes. Can't trust anyone anymore. Even the fucking FBI lie to you. But then the machine lights up and he says, hey, here we go. And then he moves to pick up the pages that are being printed, and he says, here it comes. And then he picks up the piece of paper and looks at it, and he says, Jesus Christ, I hope I never need the FBI to find someone for me. Gave them the stills and the paperwork, and this is what we get back? The best they've got. Bastards. Then we see the page that he's looking at, and it's a picture of John on official FBI, stationery, and it says, John Constantine, file restricted. So apparently the American government is aware of John Constantine. So Brian hands Penny the page to show her, and she looks at it wide-eyed and asks, what's going on? Then we cut back to her office where she is still holding that piece of paper, and she sits down in her chair, and she turns on her TV, and there is a live news broadcast at a new shooting that has just occurred. And the reporter is saying, Carlton Harris, 11 years old, arrived at school late during the morning break, took out a pistol, and killed 5 other children before shooting himself in the face. Mark Spears live for CNN. We'll bring you more information on this tragedy as I get it. Then another man asks, Mark, can we get a look at the scene? And Mark answers, sure, John. Max, come about. And then we get a bunch of images of this horrific school shooting where we see the 5 dead children and the child gunman dead on the ground, surrounded by people crying. And in the background of one of these images, we see John Constantine, and this time he's looking down, and he's rubbing his face like he can't believe this is happening again. Then we cut to Penny, who's walking down the halls of her office with Brian, and she's saying, "It's deciding what to blame, you know. Blame for the parents keeping a gun in the house? Not without blaming the Constitution and pulling the NRA's chain." And then Brian chips in, "The movies, the video games, the comic books." And then Penny says, "More killers fixate and draw inspiration from the Bible than any other piece of culture." Then Brian jokes, "So if I did a Nintendo thing called Flying Chainsaw Jesus, I'd be rich?" And disgusted, Penny says, "Ew, and you've got kids." And Brian says, "And that's how I know. You ought to see the little bastards playing their video games. Eyes bright, teeth bared, like wolves tearing up a sheep." And Penny says, "It's not the games that do it, Brian." And Brian replies, "You keep telling me what it isn't. Tell me what it is." And Penny replies, "God, if I knew, I'd bottle it up and spray it all over every school in the country." And then she stops walking and checks her bag real quick, and she says, "Hold on. Damn it. Knew the bag felt light. Left my tape recorder in the office." And Brian says, "Penny, I have to leave like now to pick up the boys from football practice." But Penny smiles and says, "Then go. You can owe me a ride. I'll get the bus home." And Brian asks, "You sure?" And Penny answers, "No big deal. See you tomorrow." Then we cut to Penny walking into her office, and as she unlocks the door and pushes it open, we see someone push the play button on her boombox, and we hear screaming from the Jonestown Massacre people as they're crying out in fear. And Jim Jones is saying, "We're committing an act of revolutionary suicide, protesting against the conditions of an inhuman world." And this startles the hell out of Penny because she screams out as she sees John Constantine standing by her desk, and he looks at her and says, "Not the new Whitney Houston album then? I was just thinking she's fucking changed a bit." And then Penny screams back, "How did you get in here?" But then she looks at his face and realizes who it is. She recognizes it from the videotapes, and she stops and her eyes begin to tear as she says, "Oh my God." And then John turns his back on her and pulls out a cigarette, and he says, "Came in through the bleeding door. How do you think? Mind if I smoke?" And then she rushes for the door, but the handle won't budge, and as John lights his cigarette, he says, "It's locked. We need to have a bit of a chin wag, you and me. Sit down." But she doesn't sit, John does in her chair, and he looks at her as he smokes with a smile on his face, and he says, "So, you're the one who makes up the minds for the great and good over these child-on-child killings in schools. Got all your evidence, I see. How's it going?" And Penny gets defensive and says, "I don't make up anybody's mind for them. I'm just providing insight." And John says, "Boogieing around the office to the screams of poisoned kids in Jonestown. Helping with the old intuition then, is it? Lovely." And then he opens one of her drawers and begins rifling through the tapes, and he pulls out the one that says Louisiana, and she asks, "What are you doing?" But he doesn't answer, and then she asks, "Why are you always there?" And he says, "Oh, I've been spotted, have I? I'm here on a favor for a mate. His wife left him, you see. Took their only son and the new bloke over the water to glorious America to start a new life far away from him. Which is fair enough, really. He's a bit of a tosser." And then John gets very serious and looks back at her and says, "But his only son got his brains blown clean across a playground in Louisiana the other month." And then John stands up and brings the tape labeled Louisiana over to the VCR, and he puts it in, and as he does this, he says, "Him and his killer were both 10 years old, and no one was telling me, mate, what was going on. So he begged me to come over here and have a shufty for meself, see what the score is. So I've been having a butcher's look, nosing around, seeing what I can see. Just like you. Getting anywhere?" And then he moves quickly and gets right in her face, and he yells, "No, you're bloody not!" And this startles her pretty bad, but John continues passionately saying, "I've read your notes, your bloody thesis. You don't have the faintest fucking idea what you're looking at, just like the rest of the stupid fucking country. You've got all these tapes and bits of fucking paper, and look at you. You haven't slept in at least a week, or I'm a fucking banana. And you're nowhere, are you? You're all looking for something to blame, when you should be looking out the window. I mean, it's typical, isn't it? You're looking for that one thing to subtract out of the children's lives to make it all better. Take out the video games, the funny music, the food coloring. Kids won't shoot each other anymore. And as the video plays, he pauses it right as the child with the gun is pointing it at his friend's son. And John points to the boy with the gun and says, "You're not looking at what's on these tapes. Here, what do you see? I'm not here to hurt you, Penny. I won't lay a finger on you. Just look at this." So she gets close to the TV screen, and as she looks, she says, "I see a kid that's going to kill another kid for no goddamn reason." And John says, "No, look." And I guess he pressed play at some point because he tells her, "He's drawn the gun, and none of the children are running away. I see kids in a schoolyard, in some dead-end hole of a town, in some asshole country, in some crumbling state, with no education, and no hope, and no future, and they're waiting. They're just standing there, born into a life that's already slid out of view, looking forward to turning out just like their mommies and daddies. Life already lived for them. Life in a world mommy and daddy couldn't be arsed to build properly. A world that makes no fucking sense. A world where kids actually go to special classes to learn to recognize real emotions and body language because they were raised by the television. They're only kids, for Christ's sake. This is the best response they can manage to the insane fucking world they're in. They stand there and wait for the bullet." And then John points to the TV again and says, "Look at that piece of tape again. Really study it. Look at that kid's mouth. He's not running, not screaming. He's about to have his face shut off, and he's saying something quietly. Look at what he's saying. Look." And then Penny stares at horror as she sees the son of John's friend look into the eyes of the child pointing a gun at him, and with a desperate, pleading look on his face, he tells the attacker, "Shoot." And that, my friends, is the end of the issue. And I gotta say, that is a very heavy issue, but boy, does it make you think, and especially that whole speech that John gave at the end about the world that these kids are growing up in, and the hopelessness that they feel, and where the world is headed, and what their parents and other adults have left for them. And on top of that, you have all the Jonestown stuff too, which just adds to the heaviness of this issue. So I can see why they pulled it, but I do think it is an important issue, and it's very prescient even nowadays. Maybe even more than back then. But that wraps it up for this episode. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planes, trains, and comic books, all one word, @gmail.com. And we will see you on the next one.